halal fun is boring though.
Islam is a very disciplined religion, but it's also easy and moderate.
Mufti Menk had said in one of the videos I had seen of him,
it is prohibited for us to attend a function where haram is going to happen, even if it is the nikah of your own father or brother or son or sister or uncle or aunt. You will not attend in order not to be from amongst those who have made shaitan happy when someone is supposed to be celebrating half of their iman.
One of the most foolish people are those who repent with intention to commit the sin again. Andrew Tate accepted Islam. He was mentioning the same thing, that
I can walk through London with a t-shirt saying Jesus is gay and nothing will happen to me.
How the Christians have dealt with their religion, now Muslims are doing that. If you try to draw a picture, and especially a mocking picture of our Prophet, we will not tolerate that. One time we were meeting Rishta and we were told, like, just don't wear a thobe because you might scare them.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another conversation here at The Lost Message. We have today with us Brother Umar. Brother Umar, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Thank you for taking the time out. I know you've been waiting for a while. We had some technical difficulty. So to get started, I'm going to recap a few things that we talked about before sitting here and starting to record. So you are in your last year of Alim course.
Yes.
If you don't mind just kind of giving us an insight on what your course looks like, the length of it. I know you said it was 7 years, but just kind of walk us through some of the prerequisites that are needed.
The main focus in the beginning of any traditional Alim course is Arabic, because Arabic is the key to understanding the Quran, to the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, and all of the classical texts. Of course, you have some Persian texts, some Ottoman, Turkish, but Arabic is the key. So the first, I would say, 2 to 3 years are heavily in Arabic. That includes syntax, nahu, grammar, vocabulary, poetry, etc., just to understand the language of the Quran. After that, you will, in Arabic, access the text of fiqh, right? So, which is Islamic law, and beginning and intermediate level of tafsir, and introduction to hadith literature. And when you advance a little bit into the intermediate level, then you will study usul, which is the principles, how to understand the Quran. What are the legal principles of interpreting religious texts? So that includes, if one verse of the Quran mentions this, and another verse of the Quran mentions something which may be, seemingly contradictory, what are the parameters for which the scholars of tafsir and hadith and Islamic law are going to now interpret those texts? And this is something that you see in, you have a constitution, right? For example, our constitution. And then you have, Supreme Court justices, you have lawyers. They all kind of interpret the Constitution in their own way.
When you say Constitution,
I'm talking about our actual
the American
Constitution, okay. Right?
So from an Islamic perspective, there is that concept of Constitution.
Yeah, we'll have our Constitution, our Islamic Sharia, but then now there is some, you could say, uncertain matters, right? Like the Quran says, مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ, that some verses and some rulings of Islam are very clear-cut, and some are not so clear. So they are open to interpretation. So you have to, anyone can just open the Quran and start interpreting. Let's say, I think this means this, or I think this ruling is this way because the Quran says this, whereas that's where difference of opinion comes, right? And then you have valid difference of opinion and you have invalid difference of opinion. So trying to learn what is considered valid difference of opinion, where two people can be sitting at the table and interpreting one verse in completely different ways, concluding different legal rulings, but you're saying that your approach is valid. So learning those valid methods as opposed to the invalid methods. Once you have a good grasp of those principles, then you'll advance into actually exercising those principles in the content of the Quran and of the Hadith. So you will read Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, you'll read the Muwatta of Imam Malik.
What year are you doing this in?
So now this is going to the advanced year. So this is the final 2 years. Where so after
6 and 7.
Yeah, this is year 6 and 7. Where now you're actually applying all of what you learned from Arabic, from learning the principles, from the tools, which is, it takes at least 5 years just for that.
To get to that.
Before
you get into Bukhari.
Before you actually take the Quran and tafsir and the hadith and seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and start using those tools, it'll take you at least 5 years to get to that level, just to get those tools ready. And then with the teachers, you'll apply those tools and see how our classical scholars came to these conclusions. And post graduate studies, they'll include specializing in Islamic law, specializing in tafsir, and specializing in hadith, whether that's matan or the sanad, which means
the chain,
the chain, because that itself is a whole field which could take many years, understanding each and every narrator and where they came from and different approaches to each sciences. So that's a basic, you could say, summary of a traditional Islamic alim course.
And as a prerequisite, you don't need to be a hafiz to become an alim.
Yeah, it's a separate thing.
It's a separate.
We have many teachers and across the world, and even the institutes I studied in, who haven't memorized the Quran, because it's not a necessary prerequisite to learn the Islamic sciences.
So as an alim, once you finish the course, are you capable of reading the Quran in Arabic and understanding the verses that you're reading based off of your knowledge of Arabic at this point?
So there are different levels of understanding the Quran, right? Whether that's in a traditional alim course or kind of sometimes they have an intensive Arabic study for Quranic. I'm not talking about any particular institute, but sometimes they have where you'll be able to understand the majority of the Quran. Basically, you get a feel for the Quranic language, right? It's a different dialect than modern Arabic, so you understand the majority of the words. Usually, the 30th juz has really dense vocabulary, like al-haqqa, al-qari'ah, wal-nazi'ati gharqa. Those are difficult, short ayahs with a lot of meaning. Whereas the beginning surahs like Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Ali Imran, etc., those will be a little easier to understand. So that I would say in the first 1 or 2 years, you should be able to really you could be praying Taraweeh and understand majority of what's being recited.
As an alim.
Yeah, even within the first 2 years of starting your alim course.
Okay.
Yeah, and once you've finished your alim course studies, I'd say you should be very comfortable with opening any part of the Quran and getting the majority of the meaning. Of course, there'll be some vocabulary here. You have to access the tafsir works. But I think just understanding the Arabic Quran, even someone who doesn't finish the alim course, whether if they understand Arabic Quran language within the first 2-3 years, they can achieve that.
So obviously, I heard you use the word rulings, and for many of us that haven't gone through the education that you have in Islam, a lot of it is very complicated. So complicated that most of the people just get disinterested in understanding the rulings and understanding some of the details that you talked about. So I guess my question primarily for you at this point is, how do you see the average Muslim today? Obviously, you have a level of knowledge that many of us don't, and higher chances that we're not going to get that level of knowledge, not having gone through the studies that you have. But from an average Muslim, for an average Muslim, where do you see us from a practicing perspective? Many of us think we're practicing.
So I can speak, I guess, based on my own experience. For myself and my family got into level of appreciation for Islamic studies. And I think it's mostly a lack of knowledge. It's, an unfortunate level of ignorance that has kind of spread a lack of appreciation for learning what actually our religion is. And this is emphasized by the Prophet ﷺ so many times, where he says, "Talabul ilmi faridatun ala kulli Muslim." So seeking knowledge is fard for every single Muslim. Now, what level of knowledge? That's different based on the content. So it's fard for every Muslim to learn about their fard ayn, right? So what is fard for me to give from my zakat? What is fard for me to know about my wudu? Fard for me to know about performing hajj, right? Fard in domestic affairs, right? People don't really learn the Islamic rulings for every, interaction. What is the fard of dealing with your neighbors, of transactions, of travel, etc.? things we do day to day. These are all fard. So first is that I think people don't know these things. And on top of that, they don't know that they don't know. They don't know what they're supposed to know. If you or I are sitting and we don't know what we're supposed to know, and on top of that, we don't know that we're supposed to learn that and we're supposed to teach our kids, then that's where you kind of see this darkness or ignorance or lack of importance to the Islamic rulings. Where, before I studied Islam, I didn't really know that I'm supposed to learn more than just, the basic Sunday school education. That as long as I've gone to Sunday school, I know, that I'm supposed to eat halal, eat haram, and avoid haram, and pray my 5 daily prayers, and, pray the Eid prayer, and maybe dress a certain way in certain times. I didn't really know what else there was to learn. So
would you say your family typically would you consider your family to be a religious family?
I would say now, from an outsider's perspective, right, trying to look at how an outsider may look at us, since we, do have an emphasis on Islamic education, on, dressing with modesty, and, trying to avoid, certain sinful practices in public, and, giving importance to Islam. I would say the average person who would look at us would say this person is religious, right? Now, obviously, Allah is the judge of hearts, but I would say in terms of what the outsider would see, they may see like practicing religious, inshallah.
So from a rulings perspective, and I say this because you're almost completing, you're going to complete your Alim course soon. When I go to masjids for Jummah or Eid, or hear some bayans in Ramadan or any other days, I don't particularly hear rulings as part of the sermon. A lot of times it's stories, right? Stories about the Prophet ﷺ, high-level information about how you can come close to Allah, obeying Allah. We hear the word obey Allah a lot, and I think most of us don't really connect the dots of what does that really mean. So we're obeying Allah for the big commitments of the religion, the 5 pillars, and then disobeying them for some of the small day-to-day rulings that you mentioned. Why do you think there is that gap?
I think one part is that Muslims have become very kind of sensitive, and
Do you think it's a conscious effort on the imams or the scholars that are speaking, that they don't want to scare the Muslims sitting in the audience too much? Or
so what I've seen is they don't focus too much on going in details for rulings sometimes. Although I have seen some scholars, they do try to at least introduce some of them, right? But at one level, there is a wisdom behind not scaring them. And I think that definitely is one reason, because, sometimes the only exposure to what people have to Islamic, education, if you want to call it, is the Jummah. And even that, they may attend half of it or the last 10 minutes, or maybe they'll get the whole thing. So to tell them, this is halal and this is haram, to an average person who may not come to the masjid at all, except for Jummah prayer, it may confuse them. Because in order to, especially nowadays, when we're living in a place where everything else is very appealing, and everything else is made to seem superior than our religion and our practices and our way of life, our legal theory. People have tried to make everything else seem more superior without understanding the spirit of Islam or the wisdom behind rulings. It's very difficult. So what I would say is, and the Jummah khutbah is very short, right? 15 to maybe 30 minutes max. So to try to cover the rulings, but it's not really a place for that. Although nowadays it's kind of like, if that's the only exposure, there definitely should be. Muslims should be known, should be taught and told, this is halal. So I think usually the imams will focus more on Islamic, civilizational values as opposed to strict rulings. But I think that rulings should be introduced, but accompanied with that, you need to have the wisdom and the reasoning behind it, right? For example, Luqman alayhi salam in the Quran, when he advised his son to stay away from committing shirk, say, Ya bunayya la tushrik billah. That's what most of us do. We advise our children, our family, don't do this. But then what's after that? It says, Inna shirka la dhulmun azim. He gives the reasoning behind it. He says that shirk is a great oppression. It's an act of oppression. It is an act of injustice. So accompanying the ruling with the wisdom behind it, with the reasoning behind it. I think that's what's important, at least at the level of the Jummah khutbah.
Mm-hmm.
If you're telling children that, okay, we need to come and pray to the masjid, we need to see more youth in the masjid, well, tell them the benefit of praying.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them the harms of not praying at a very spiritual level. Not just that if you don't pray, then you'll suffer and you'll be punished. It has to like touch their heart. It has to open their minds. It has to really convince them in that way.
You talked about shirk, and we can segue into this. This is probably a good point to what I'm about to mention. So the idea of shirk, right? It's the worst crime that you could do in Islam. It's the biggest sin in Islam. Is it? Would that be an accurate statement?
Yes, that would be accurate.
Okay. So when I understand shirk, we're saying you cannot associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right?
Yes.
No partners with the Prophet, no partners with Allah. So if someone is to associate partners with Allah, the outcome of that would be they wouldn't take Allah's word as an absolute truth, as the final word of Allah being the Quran. They would obviously take the word coming from that whichever they've associated that partner with.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of simplify this, by committing shirk, you're diluting the word of Allah. You're diluting the religion into potentially that which Allah has never mentioned, potentially going in a direction that Allah doesn't want you to go. Mm-hmm. From a common man's perspective, that's how I understand shirk. Would that be an accurate understanding of why shirk is looked at the way it is looked at? Kind of stepping away from its face value. Obviously, whatever is a sin is a sin. We don't argue against that. But for the audience and for myself, for others who in their minds we feel we don't do shirk, which means we don't literally associate partners with Allah. But the kind of lifestyle we're living, we've made things okay for ourselves that are completely opposite to the word of Allah. Mm-hmm. So shirk is not really attached to us living this way, but the end result of shirk is kind of you swaying away from the word of Allah. Yeah, do you agree with that?
Well, there are levels of shirk, right? So there is that level of shirk which in the world we would consider this person no longer a believer. And that is doing something as explicit as, associating partners with Allah or doing an act which is specific to another religion, right? And then you have shirk, which is, as you mentioned, doing something which as a result you are following something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's book or his commandment. It mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-A'raf, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى. Do not see the one who has taken his desires as his God, right? So one can argue that this seems almost as a type of shirk, or a type of worshipping something other than Allah. As he is mentioning himself, you're taking your desires as your God. What does that mean? It doesn't mean you're worshipping yourself physically, but it means that you are obeying your nafs as you're supposed to obey Allah. You are following it and you are almost worshipping it, idolizing it as you are supposed to be doing to Allah. So I think that level of shirk may, it's kind of like a dangerous game to play. But, for Muslims to avoid any being astray at all from the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important if we see that there is almost a level of minor shirk to that.
So what do you say to Muslims that, kind of picking up on what you said, worshipping their desires over Allah, right? So what do you say to the Muslim that completely denounces some of the rulings? There's the guy who doesn't know the ruling and is doing it out of ignorance, but doesn't have the arrogance to denounce it? Like if you tell the person, they're like, okay, well, inshallah, one day. What do you say to the person who completely denounces a ruling and just wants to believe and showcase that this thing doesn't exist?
That's a very good question. You have to really get to the core of what Islam means. What is Islam? So oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier, the kind of Western way has been made to seem superior to all other ways, where they want to enforce, this Western democracy on other, countries, right? Other underdeveloped societies. So we have to show that Islam is superior in every single matter, whether that's in our religious affairs or our, domestic affairs, in the way we dress, in the way we execute our criminal law, in what we eat, right? So we have to showcase that Islam is superior in every and each way. Those Muslims who, they believe in Islam, but then when you present them and you say, this is Islam, this is a ruling that's mentioned in the Quran, this is a ruling which the Prophet ﷺ practiced himself or he commanded to follow, and it doesn't sit right with them, or they say that, this can't be correct. Well, first, they should be educated, right? And I think that's one thing where people really want to understand why, right? That question was not always there in the previous generations, right? Maybe our parents and parents before. If you look, especially in the subcontinent, Hinduism is not an intellectual religion as Christianity or other philosophies are. Hinduism is more so, I'd say, cultural and basically following the religion of the forefathers. As mentioned in the Quran when talking about shirk, following the religion of the forefathers. So our parents and our grandparents didn't necessarily always have to intellectually understand Islam to appreciate it. They appreciate it from a very organic and simple way. But now here, when there's almost like an intellectual warfare going on between all these different ideologies, all these different political theories, then you definitely need to answer the question why, right? Now, despite that, you can say Islam is superior and Islam's rulings are this way because, X, Y, and Z. This is the benefit that you'll feel. This is the benefit that the individual will experience. This is the benefit that a society and the whole world will experience by implementing Islam and the Sharia. Despite that, they or even ourselves, we may come at some roadblocks where we don't necessarily fully understand the wisdom behind a certain ruling. And this happens sometimes, certain rulings about women, right? Certain rulings about the hijab, about Islam, about interest, about Islamic military, etc. Not every ruling is going to be, you could say, understood and fully, accepted by us in that sense. We may still feel like, I don't really understand this. But that is when a person's Islam really comes into play, because Islam, as opposed to popular belief, doesn't mean just peace. Salam means peace, right? Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Islam means submission, right? It means that even if if I'm not happy with this, I'm going to submit. I'm going to acquiesce to it. I'm going to say that even though this may not be what I want to do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded me and I will do it. Even if there's something I don't understand, right? For example, the Muslims at the time of Hudaybiyah, the peace treaty, and I advise, the listeners to read on the seerah of what exactly happened. But that was a time when the Muslims, they wanted to perform the Umrah, right? And the peace treaty between the Quraysh and the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims was so extremely unfair that it did not make sense for the Muslims to accept that treaty. It did not make sense that if someone from the believers was to escape to Quraysh, then Quraysh would keep them. But if someone from the Quraysh was to escape to the Muslim would have to return them. And this would go on for 10 years and a lot of unfair.
Escape, do you mean like captured? Migrated?
So for example, if a person living in Mecca, right, they escaped Mecca. What I mean is, migrated, right? They left Mecca to come to the Muslim lands. Then the Muslim would have to send them back. It's almost, imagine like two countries, right? A person fleeing from America wanting to go to a different country, right?
Oh.
Leaving their
So like escaping.
escaping.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not actually, I do believe it was as prisoners or captors. Yeah.
Okay.
The Quraysh, they had this, unfair agreement that if someone escapes from us, then that's fine. But if one of you guys escape, then you have to return them. So again, the point is that Islam is submission. So our intellect cannot fully understand every single thing about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether that's about how He lives, how He creates, why He created, or about His rulings. We can understand some things, right? Like you and I, we can sit here and we can understand the wisdom behind hijab, and we can understand the wisdom behind praying 5 times a day, about the cleanliness, certain things. But not necessarily everyone is going to understand that. There are Muslim sisters who they dress the modest way, but they maybe in their heart they have not really fell in love, right? They have not really fell in love with the hijab, but they still do it. That actually is one of the highest levels of submission, because even though you don't want to do it or you don't necessarily understand it, you're still doing it.
You're still submitting.
You're still submitting. And I think that's sometimes what people, they forget, that I want to, practice once I feel good about it. That's not necessarily what Islam means, right? Yes, you want to feel good about it. You want to feel good about being a Muslim. You want to feel good about obeying Allah. But there will be times where everyone faces, well, they'll have to do something. It's not going to feel good. It's not going to just, you're not going to always feel good about it. Maybe you'll feel like, why am I doing this? But if at least the answer is I'm doing this because Allah commanded it, that's enough.
So going back to the treaty that you said was unfair, were you trying to get to like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam accepted it, and everybody had to accept it even though they didn't like it and they didn't agree with it?
So the Muslims, right? So the Prophet ﷺ already was given the glad tidings that there's going to be the Fath, right? But the Muslims, they didn't really understand that yet. Even though the verses were revealed and they knew it, they didn't really fully understand, the end goal or the wisdom behind it. So they were kind of, very, their hopes were let down. They were all in ihram and they had their sacrificial animals ready. So imagine if we are going for Hajj and then our visa gets cancelled, right? You had all this preparation. So they had that times, Allah knows. So yet that the Prophet ﷺ had to, remind them and to teach them that we are accepting this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the glad tidings.
There's wisdom behind it.
There's wisdom behind it. There's trust in the plan. Although it doesn't seem beneficial from a worldly perspective to agree to this. It doesn't seem beneficial from a religious perspective to go with this treaty, but there is wisdom behind it. And, he as the Prophet is emphasizing this. So then, eventually the Prophet went out and he sacrificed his own animal and he shaved his own hair. So then the people started following and actually Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, he was the one saying to the Prophet, like, we are Muslims, right? We are superior. Why should we agree to these terms, right?
Hazrat Umar was
yes
of this view at that point.
Yes.
Okay.
So he actually went to other companions. I believe he went to Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anh, and he mentioned the same thing, that why are we agreeing to this? That they had this pride for Islam. They had this for Islam and His Messenger and for Islam in general. So after that, after understanding that there is a wisdom behind it, then they accept it. Although outwardly, the point is, outwardly it may not make sense to you, but once you understand that there's a wisdom behind it, whether you know it or not, whether you can feel it or see it or not, there is something behind it, then that is the true meaning of Islam.
Could this summarize the idea behind tawakkul? Having that tawakkul in Allah, whether you get it, whether you don't get it, whether you understand it, whether you don't understand it, you kind of just have that faith.
I think tawakkul is a big part of it. Yes, if we hope, at least we have hope in reward, right? That's the main thing that is emphasized in the Sunnah, where the Prophet ﷺ says, when in terms of fasting, right? Man sama Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaban. Whoever fasts in the month of Ramadan with faith and ihtisaban, means you have it's an obligation for you to hope for reward. So in terms of that, tawakkul is there. Yes, where you may not see it, you may not feel it, but you have hope for it.
what would you say to someone who uses the word iman a lot, tawakkul a lot, has a lot of good things to say about Islam if it was to be mentioned in a circle and in conversation, but then the same people show zero interest in the rulings? How do you view that perspective? Like, I love Allah, I love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I read the Quran, I have all this love for Islam and, you know, the entire religion from afar, I would say.
Yeah.
But don't tell me about these rulings. Don't ruin our lifestyle. Don't make it complicated. And they've sort of convinced themselves and their surroundings that whatever they feel and believe is totally okay.
Yeah, that's something that we see a lot, right? Like people are content with their level of practicing.
Yeah.
What they do, they feel, you know, if I pray on Eid, I go to Jummah, and I pray 5 times a day, or maybe I may miss some prayers, and I send my kids to Sunday school, but apart from that, I don't really do anything, or even less than that. As long as I'm a believer, this is kind of similar to the Christian way of practicing their religion, right? Where if you talk to a Christian, some of them date.
Yeah, the rulings are out.
The rulings are
out the door. Yeah,
they date each other. If you actually look what it says in their text, they don't really follow it. Mm-hmm. They believe that as long as you believe in Christ, then you'll experience salvation. There's actually a deviant sect in Islam called the Murji'ah who held this belief, where as long as you believe, and they quoted an interpreted verse of the Quran and statements of the Prophet to support this. As long as you believe, then sins will not harm you. You will not be punished. It's kind of that same, new Christian way of understanding your relationship with God. As long as you believe, you're safe. But Islam has a middle path where, yes, if you believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll be saved from the eternal punishment.
The eternal punishment.
Eternal punishment, right?
But you will still experience
that
punishment to begin with.
There is still the possibility, right? There's always a possibility where Allah can forgive, whether someone asks or not. Someone asks for forgiveness, sincere repentance, then for sure Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive them. That's His promise. But if someone does not ask for forgiveness, then it is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He says, يُعَذِّبُ مَن يَشَاءُ وَيَغْفِرُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. He can punish whomever He wills and He can forgive whomever He wills.
So what does repentance mean then? So let's say, for example, I live the way I live. Don't tell me about any of the minute details or rulings or whatever it is. Let me live the way I live. Let me believe what I believe. I pray. I'll do all the known ritualistic things in Islam. But I ask for forgiveness, right? Like that's not a big deal for me. I'll always pray, and at the end of my salah, Allah forgive me, Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan, all of that.
Yeah.
But I have no intention to ever leaving that which I'm part of, which is probably sinful, but I don't even care to know, right? Like that's where my mind is. What do you say to that? Like, are we saying that even me in that position, I'm being forgiven and I have this clean slate that I can rely on for the rest of my life?
The general condition for repentance are 3 or 4. One is to ask for forgiveness. So asking for forgiveness is actually a condition of repenting from a sin. One is to stop doing the sin. And one is that if you harmed or hurt anyone, meaning huququl ibad, then go back and rectify that. Yeah. If you stole from someone or you hurt someone, you physically hurt their feelings, hurt their feelings or physically hurt them, then right that wrong. So generally, those are the conditions for repentance. Again, we can't really, condemn people for, or like damn people for, by saying that for sure they will not be forgiven or what. But we should tell people, like if you want to be forgiven, then stop doing the sin. That's the first step. So, and I'm forgetting if it's a prophetic narration, Allahu Alam, but I believe it is a prophetic narration where the Prophet said, one of the most foolish people are those who they repent with intention to commit the sin again, because they do not know in which state their soul will be taken. Whether your soul will be taken while in the state of repenting, or in the state of committing the sin. So again, it's kind of just a lack of importance to the religion, and it's a contentment. It's a very, very low standard level of contentment where I'm ready to sacrifice, my sleep and my, my time and my money for the dunya. But when it comes to the religion, I'm very happy at, getting a 50%. No one's happy at getting a 50% in anything. That's an F. No one's going to give you, you're not going to get a participation award, right? You have to, you need to at least get that, bronze medal, right? If you're aiming for a bronze medal, then you may not even get that. If you're working, those Olympic, trainers who they try to get a gold medal, many of them don't even reach to bronze. A few of them get gold, a few of them, one will get silver, one will get bronze. So, and if you take it to your studies, getting into medical school or any other studies, if your goal is to get, let's say a 70%, my goal at the highest is I want to get 70%. How many people actually will get a C in the class? Very few. One person may luckily get a C, but majority of them will fail because your standard was so low. If your standard is 100% or 110%, then you'll be lucky to get an A, right?
Yeah.
So people are very content with 50% practicing their religion, or they just want to feel good. And it's also just a lack of discipline. Islam is a very disciplined religion, but it's also easy and moderate. That's what people have to understand. There's discipline involved. You have to wake up in the morning for Fajr. You have to, wash your limbs. You have to stay away from certain temptations. So there is that level of discipline, but that's beneficial for your akhirah and your dunya. But at the same time, Islam makes these things easy, which we have to, we could talk about that as well. At the end, if you're not disciplined, then it's just a laziness. If you can't wake up in the morning and you can't, make yourself move when you need to move, then you won't be able to sustain a job. You won't be able to sustain a family as a father. You won't be able to sustain relationships or a business. How do you expect to sustain your religion if that level of laziness is displayed?
Do you think that's one of the reasons we see Islam being diluted from generation to generation?
Yeah, I think when one generation doesn't really practice Islam that much, they still maybe send their children to Sunday school and maybe maktab in the evening, whatever, but overall the home environment is not too Islamic. And they don't emphasize their children to teach the following generation Islam. Then you can imagine what happens when that generation grows up. And for example, like our grandparents may have lived in a time where their parents were going to the masjid 5 times a day and they were only eating halal. And, their mother was reading Quran to them. And they went to classes which offered tafsir and hadith, a lot of that. And then the next generation, they came here and they didn't have that. And there was also not that much access to Islamic knowledge or Islamic community. So they kind of just sufficed on Sunday school and, maybe eating halal, maybe not. Then the next generation, their parents didn't tell them the importance of teaching Islam. Mm-hmm. Then, it just gets diluted until you have people I've met. They came to our door for whatever, offering, like to fix the roof or whatever. So, oh, what's your name? We say, our name is Muhammad. Oh, my grandfather's name is Muhammad. It's like, how did that happen? How was your grandfather a practicing Muslim? And then just 2 generations later, your name is not Muslim, or maybe your name is Muslim, but the religion is gone. It's just maybe a lack of practicing the religion, but also a lack of emphasizing teaching it to the next generation.
Here's the problem when people say Deen and Duniya, and they separate the two.
Yeah.
And they try to balance it. How do you feel about that sentence? I know we talked about it earlier.
No, the thing is, like, growing up as, when I started my hifz, then my extended family was kind of afraid for me that, is this kid just going to grow up and, be a Quran teacher? And
you're going to spoil their parties.
Yeah, spoil their parties, be an outcast and also maybe call them out. But at the same time, they're worried for me. Like, is he going to be able to feed himself and his family? That what are you going to do just doing hifz?
Right.
So then when I told them that, no, I am going to go to college and work in corporate America, whatever, then they were like, okay, there, you get the best of both worlds.
Right.
You're become, a lot of times we'll see that, someone who is a hafiz and a doctor,
Yeah.
Oh, they're Deen and Dunya. But where's the balance? You're giving, if you really want to look at it practically, right? Out of your 24 hours a day, how much are you giving to Islam? Are you giving, let's say you sleep for 8 hours, 16 hours. Are you giving 8 hours of your day to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Rather, we're complaining that we have to pray, for 10, 20 minutes, where we can't step outside of our workplace during Dhuhr time to make wudu, or we're afraid of, washing our feet. We're hesitant of spending maybe $200-300 a month on our children's Islamic education. If we're hesitant in spending a few $100s a month on our children's Islamic education, where we are fine moving countries, moving states, spending $1,000s for a prestigious university for their worldly education, that's showing your real value for Islam, where your idea of Deen and Dunya is barely equal, right? Even though you're claiming that you're doing equal, they're barely equal, and Islam should be far above. But people don't understand that you can practice Islam 24 hours a day. It's just implementing the Sunnah here and
you're practicing the Deen in the Dunya.
in the Dunya.
So it's not two.
It's not two things, right? Yes, exactly. It's not two things. You're practicing, for example, Islam is not just worship, right? Worship is a part of Islam.
Rituals.
Yeah, it's not just the rituals. It's not just the praying and the fasting. It's
but that's what people think it is.
People think that's Islam, but Islam is also how you treat your family, the rulings between a husband and a wife, the rulings between the parents and the children, and vice versa. How you speak, how you talk, the seerah of the Prophet, the akhlaq, the manners of Islam, actual willing good for the Muslims, right? Like we will good for our brothers and sisters in different countries, but how do we actually implement that? Are we implementing that in an Islamic way, or in a way that is just based on our nafs? You can have your own business, you can have your work, you can have your education, going to college, and you can still practice Islam 24/7. It's a mindset. It's not just rituals. Yeah, one person can be earning for his family, another person can be earning from their family. One person may not be practicing any sunnah in their earning. They may not have that intention at all. One person is doing the same exact thing outwardly, but they are making sure everything is halal. They're making sure their intention is good. They are giving zakat when they're supposed to. They are
following the rulings throughout the journey.
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
So that is Islam.
Where you're also earning, you're also living, you're also doing the rituals that you're supposed to do, and also abiding by everything that you're meant to as a Muslim. So have you spoken to the intellectuals of our community? Like they're Muslim, but this is where they lose their intellect. Rulings, Islam, the depth, they don't that's not something they're interested in. What do you see their perspective to look like? I feel they become very unintellectual when religion is brought up.
Yeah.
Because they subconsciously think of religion as this cloud. Yeah. Where they're just they're going to do a few rituals, and that'll be the end of it. And then they'll go out there and continue living in this world from a very intellectual perspective, whether it's making money, whether it's moving around socially, whether it's conducting themselves in a certain way. All of that, they understand how to do it very smartly. But when it comes to Islam, they're not very smart about it. In fact, they don't really try to seek intellectual Islam.
I think in reality, there's not much intellectualism there. I think we treat someone who has an education as intellectual, whereas the modern education system doesn't really give any actual intellect to what they're producing, right? And what I mean is, a person who studies science or medicine, etc., they're not necessarily really learning about philosophy or learning about logic, learning about actual social issues, right? They're almost like being produced as machines, right? Learn this and get hired and you'll make money. Those people, we see people as people who are educated. We see them as intellectuals, but in reality, they haven't been. If you speak to them about, like you said, speak to them about Islam, they don't really seem smart. That's because they haven't really learned how to think. But we kind of treat them as if they're extremely smart. So we have to kind of humble them in a good way. We show them that there is so much more to being intellectual and being educated than just memorizing things and being able to do things with your hands, right? Doing surgery, etc. There's much more to be intellectual about than that. So then if you express, you have to, one good thing for I think intellectual working professionals is talk to them about Islam within their field, right? Introduce Islamic bioethics to them, because they know that's something that they know. They know bioethics. They know medicine. Now introduce to them how Islamic bioethics is a superior medical ethics than what they've learned and what they practice. And you can show them practical examples. You can show them statistics. You can show them the results of that. So I think the
issue is they don't want to hear that.
They don't want to hear that. So you have to bring it up to them. You know, they're kind of against like the general Molvi, right? Especially the one who's dressed like that.
Yeah.
So they don't want to hear the normal, like they don't want to hear the normal,
the extremist view.
Yeah. So don't bring any of that up. Just bring, which requires us to be kind of familiarized with bioethics or medicine, right? So that's why there's a need for properly trained Islamic or Muslim doctors who have connections with religious institutes. So that way Muslim scholars can be educated somewhat about bioethics.
Right.
Then you present bioethics to, whether they're a Muslim or non-Muslim, but let's focus on Muslim. If they're a Muslim doctor and you show them that, hey, you want to talk about medicine? Well, what you're doing here, if we did it the Islamic way, it would have a better medical effect in the medical field, because that's what they're focused on, right? They're focused on real world application, real world benefits. So if you show them that, yes, we're talking about religion, but we're talking about the worldly effect of practicing the Sharia in your field, which is medicine, and how that is better, then they'll appreciate that. They'll actually appreciate that.
You said something interesting, and I think that's really the missing key in the issue that we're facing today. The real world effect of Islam. Like, that is what most of us are far away from. That's where most of us don't see the benefit. So the social interactions in Islam, the way to do business in Islam, staying away from interest, like the real world effect of this is what we don't necessarily see or understand. And
Exactly.
we really categorize all of that as this like old school mentality, whether you're talking to people about segregation between men and women, the mahram, the non-mahram, you're talking to someone about hijab, you're talking to someone about these things that seem very like old school, boring, like really, do we have to? But the intellect isn't telling them much when they think of these things. They're not looking at the real world effect. Why do you think we don't have that kind of a conversation that happens more in the Islamic community?
So I think eventually such people do appreciate those real world things, but only when themselves or their family is actually experiencing it, right? Like the effects of removing modesty from the culture, right? The parents, maybe they grew up without really a good sense of,
like you said, you guys were kind of looked at as extremists at one point. Like, for what would you be looked at as an extremist for?
Just the fact that we were put in a full-time hifz program.
Just because of that?
Just that.
Did it change your lifestyle at home?
It did. I'd say like, we would be the people who led the prayers, right? Okay. So there's a hafiz. Sometimes we would dress like, we would wear our topis, right? So just those couple of things were enough to make us seem like
extremists.
Yeah, just those things.
Nothing else.
Yeah, nothing else. Even one time we were meeting, a prospective rishta for one of our relatives, and we were told like, hey, don't wear a thobe, just wear a kurta, right?
Was this for you?
Yeah, they told us not for me. Okay. Not for me. I was just one of the nephews. So I was not even like, it didn't matter what I did. Right. But just like
they told a guy not to wear a thobe.
They told us nephews, right? For one of my
You were just a spectator there.
I'm nothing, just a little kid running around.
Okay, got it.
They said, no, you just don't wear a thobe because you might scare them. So just wear a kurta. So even to that level of, just having a slightly longer, piece of clothing
Right.
that doesn't have slits.
Don't let it stay above your ankle.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
why do you think that is? What is your thobe going to do? Obviously, they're looking at it from a perspective that you're going to scare them because you are going to represent something that they're not going to like.
Yeah.
And saying Islam is simplifying it. You're going to represent Islam, and that's not what they're not going to like. They're not going to like the type of Muslim you are.
Yeah.
And what is this type of Muslim? One that just follows everything?
There's also a sense of guilt, right? That they may be
They're not doing it.
That, this is technically what Islam says. Maybe they know it, maybe they don't really understand it, but sometimes they may have even been, kind of, shamed for that, which is, that's not really the approach you want to take, right? You don't want to make them feel bad about it. You have to give nasiha. And nasiha is an interesting word because, usually we understand it to mean good advice or advice, right? Give advice. But nasiha in Arabic also has the meaning of wishing and intending good for the Muslims. If you want good for someone, but your approach to advising them is pushing them further away, that it takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of wisdom on how to explain, the beauty and religion, the rulings of Islam, right? So yeah, people get kind of, they feel kind of guilty. They feel like, I know I'm not doing that, and this person obviously is in the same gathering as me, and I don't want to be reminded that I'm doing something wrong. Or I don't want to be reminded that I need to change my ways. There was actually one kid. He was a kid, and he was told that I'm not really ready to leave watching movies and all those things. I know it's the right thing to do, but I'm not really ready to swallow that pill, So that could be one thing, that people know it, but they don't want to be reminded that, I'm not really the best me yet.
I see a lot of people from our community that are very comfortable and content with the way they are. And on top of that, a lot of it, I feel, gets validated by religious personalities that they might know, they might be close to. One example you gave earlier, I know we were talking about weddings in general.
Yeah.
And if there is a ceremony, a nikah ceremony, there's a slot in the beginning of it for a kid, typically from the Hifz program, to come and, recite a few surahs. And then, there's a sermon from the khatib, and the party continues as is after.
Yeah.
So doing these things gives the satisfaction to the audience or the guests that, we did something Islamic, and, we respected that part of the religion. So the Deen was taken care of. Now Duniya comes, you bring the DJ on. But that khatib being there validated. And that's one of the things that's been an issue for me once I started learning, is to, why do these people go to these weddings?
Yeah.
You know how the women are dressed, the attitude of the men, there's a DJ there, the entire party is not representing what you represent, but you're offering your service in an environment. So you being there is that silent approval.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? What do you say to that?
So there needs to be, with especially religious figures, there needs to be a balance, which is you advise people in a very, kind and caring and wise manner, where you don't turn them away, you don't condemn them, you are giving them da'wah, right? And sometimes you have to treat it as a prescription, whereas some people are so engulfed in their ways and their habits that you just give them a little bit, right? Teach them a little bit about Islam, try to get them to appreciate Islam, and slowly they'll change their ways themselves. So that has to be there. But at the same time, we should not be compromising what the actual religion represents. Actually, many Christians appreciate this about Islam and about Muslims. And you'll see, when before Andrew Tate accepted Islam, right? He was mentioning the same thing, that if you like compare how the Christians have dealt with their religion and how Muslims are doing, that if you try to draw a picture, and especially a mocking picture of our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we will not tolerate that.
Right.
So as religious figures representing Islam, whether they like it or not, they are representing Islam by saying, you're a sheikh or imam, etc. You cannot be compromising of what Islam says.
Right.
So you cannot start saying, whether that's actively or passively, just by someone being there, right? Being in a gathering, of mixed gathering, music, etc. You have to show some sort of disapproval to it. You have to show that Islam does not compromise when it comes to this. Now that's separate than the way you advise, right? You advise people with kindness and caring, right? Even Musa alayhi salam was commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to address Fir'aun in a soft and gentle manner, right? So that's the way we advise. We'll teach them some things, we'll make them learn about Islam, but as long as they don't feel uncomfortable. But there has to be at least some level of reality. Even if it makes them feel a little uncomfortable, there has to be some sort of a fine line where you're not compromising.
From the kind of environment I come from, for us, we would kind of see their presence as an approval.
Yeah.
And it kind of tells us that it's okay. You can celebrate in this way. You can do these things as long as, you pray, you do. So it starts reinforcing our own idea of Islam and makes us feel like the other side is extreme when they try to prevent X, Y, Z, because this to us is normal.
Yeah.
Mufti Menk actually was, and the reason why I talked to you earlier about, these bayans and these khutbahs in masjid, not really specifying certain things that I feel people really need to hear. Because Mufti Menk had said in one of the videos I had seen of him, is he called for all the ulama to boycott any mixed gathering, nikahs or walimas. No, not just nikah walima, just any mixed gathering in general, especially the nikah, where they are going there as the khatib to do the ceremony. He said he doesn't attend, and he addresses other religious figures not to attend these and not really give their approval to be there, because it's their intention might be good, like you said, but the effect on an average person that's sitting in the audience is giving the wrong message of Islam completely. And you know what? They're going to run with it.
I think one thing is, and some people do this, where you have ulama calling out these certain, you have shuyukh calling out, or not necessarily calling out, but advising these other shuyukh that, hey, you are an example for these young Muslims and you are representing Islam. Represent it in the correct way. Don't compromise the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. So I think there is that. We may not necessarily see it, but there is that kind of checks and balances within the ulama community. Every scholar, every religious leader has to have someone above them where they are seeking advice from. If you have especially young, fresh graduates just going out and becoming Islamic leaders without any mentor or any senior sheikh to them, advising them or correcting them, then they're kind of just on their own, which, I, as someone who studied for, 6-7 years, I would say I'm nowhere near that, even for the next 20-30 years. You always need someone above you
to guide you.
Yeah.
My brother, Jazakallah khairan. I know you're on a time crunch, but before you leave, I know I had told you before you came that I do have an Instagram page called The Lost Message. And watch some of the content, and then let me know if there's any questions or concerns you have from something that you've seen there. So
Inshallah.
have you gotten a chance to go through some of the material?
Yeah, I've looked through it. MashaAllah, it's very, I'd say it's very beneficial. And so I'll reward you for your concern. I know it's that's the pure concern I can see. MashaAllah, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that I am like you as a person trying to, seeing moths just running towards an open fire, and I'm just trying to push away the moths who are, fleeing towards the fire. That's how the Prophet ﷺ is to the ummah, who are, because of the, glamour and glitter of the, pleasures of the dunya, we're just running towards the fire. And the Prophet ﷺ is just trying to save us from that. So, especially like I felt this a lot when I became more religious, or I wanted to practice Islam more, where I had such a deep, strong, burning concern for not just my family, but everyone around me. I wanted them to know the truth. I wanted them to realize, that this dunya is nothing if you don't strive for your akhirah. And we really need to wake up and rectify ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to go into a dark path. So I could see that and where you come from. But it's not a surprise to me that when you try to share that, especially with family and especially with elders, right? It's come off as extreme. They take it like, oh, who are you? Are you just an extremist? We have our own, we're content with what we're doing. So I think the best way to move forward in an actual constructive manner, especially with family, is simply just represent Islam through your own embodiment. You don't necessarily have to talk about it.
There's no forcing.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. There's no
compulsion in Deen.
Exactly.
You don't
exactly.
make someone.
If you show that I'm a better person, I'm happier, I'm more content, I have better character, I have better human interactions because of my faith, they will automatically associate that betterment of character with your newfound practicing of religion. So just that can be a form of da'wah, right? A lot of people sometimes ask, what is a way I can give da'wah to my family and friends and co-workers? Until someone has a certain level of religious education, then the main thing I would say is just practice your religion in a proud and in a beautiful manner, where that that fragrance of Islam will emanate to the people near you, and they will smell it and they will appreciate it, and they will say, what is that? Why is this person so happy? Why is this person so content? Why is this person so at peace with themselves and other people? Then they will associate that with your religiosity, and inshallah that will call them towards Islam. And at the same time, kind of showing the superior ways of Islam, right? People are so engrossed in getting more wealth and being superior in their workplace or their education, etc. So they need to actually see how practical and how better it is for them to be practicing Islam, right? So learning the practical, benefits of practicing Islam in a religious way. How, there are people who have never prayed, and once they start praying, they're finally at ease. They were, fulfilling all their desires and, having as much fun as they could, but their heart was empty. Then when they started praying and listening to the Quran, they felt at ease and at peace. So it takes a lot of time to get, especially family and elders, to appreciate that. So it's kind of natural for them to kind of be scared and be defensive, but just maintaining ties is, I think, one thing. Maintaining ties in relationships, obviously at the level where you're not seen as approving of something haram, right? It's completely fine to avoid certain gatherings where there's going to be haram being committed there, right? But in a respectful way where you don't want them to associate your religiosity with a bad taste. You want them to associate it with...
I feel like that's a byproduct, though. When you kind of stand up against a situation that's about
to a certain level. That depends on those people, though. Are they arrogant? Are they stubborn? Right? Because when the Prophet ﷺ was giving the message of Islam, you had two types of people. You had people who were open-minded and sincere, and you had people who were stubborn and arrogant. So those people who are sincere and open-minded in themselves, then the Prophet ﷺ's message, even though it may have taken a while, it did, emanate into their souls and in their heart, like Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, right? First, he didn't like the Prophet ﷺ or the message. Yeah, because he was saying, oh, this is, destroying families. People are disowning each other. Is causing chaos. So this was the first thing he saw.
And that happened when the Prophet ﷺ brought the message of Islam. There were conflicts within families, within community, disagreements, distances.
Yeah, it did. So that is, you could say, that will happen, but that will happen to those people who are stubborn and arrogant. But the method has to be constructive, where you're not actively doing that, right? It should.
It's not the intention.
It's not the intention, and it should not be the immediate effect, right? Some people just don't really like it's sad to say, but they're Muslims, but they don't really like anything that has to do with Islam or religion. So to those people, you can't really even bring up religion or Islam. You just have to connect to them in a very kind of
An Islamic way.
yeah, just connect to them on something, and then they'll slowly open up to it. There was one time where I wasn't even going to my family gatherings, where I just saw I was not interested. I saw people who were not at all similar to me or my interests, and I saw practices where I didn't like or approve of. And then slowly I started getting back, and now alhamdulillah I maintain relationships with all of them. And I try to, especially since I'm older, it helps, right? If I'm like a teenage kid, they don't really take you seriously.
Right.
But now, since I am older, they actually do listen to what I have to say, and they'll appreciate it. It's a long process, especially more so than us, but like converts who accept Islam.
I can imagine their pain.
I know people who they accepted Islam and they wanted everyone to just be Muslim.
Yeah.
And that's especially because they're dealing with family who are, if they don't accept Islam, then their fate is extremely serious.
Yeah.
So they really have that. But what they do is they start here, read the Quran, read this, keep forwarding, Islamic videos and all these things. But what that does is just makes them want to stay away from you. It annoys them.
Right.
So you don't want to come off as annoying. You don't want to come off as, condemning them. So at that stage, you kind of do want them to make, the feel good Islam. That's okay in the beginning stage. Make them feel good. Invite them, invite them to your home, invite them to an Islamic gathering. And, it's almost like bribing them, let's do this small Islamic thing. And, let's also have some, halal fun. Eventually they'll open up to it.
Halal fun is boring though.
It's not. The reality is it's not. That's one thing. You have to, it takes an effort to, for example, how we do with our kids. If you take something away, you have to replace it with something. That's one thing people don't always do. Right? You take something away. You're saying this is prohibited. You're telling your family, hey, this is the wrong way to do things. Well, you have to replace it with something. Replace it with something better. Replace it with something that is permissible.
There's an interesting clip I had seen where, the conversation was about the soft and happy message of Islam that attracts you without going into the nitty gritty of rulings and all of that, just the happy Islam side. And then there's the other approach where it's very aggressive and it's very and it was an interesting conversation because the other side was coming from a perspective of, well, they don't have time. They don't have the time they think they have. I can give them the nice, soft, loving Islam and, the feel-good Islam.
Yeah.
But what they're doing with it is they're misinterpreting it, using it to their benefit and continuing to fulfill their desires. And they're running out of time. They have no idea. The other side is still holding on to the idea that no, the feel-good Islam is really the way to go because, that's what's going to eventually bring them on. So the concern of the other guy, someone like Muhammad Haplos, have you heard? He's an aggressive guy. He's very loud. He's not trying to waste your time, nor is he trying to make you feel, happy about things. He's trying to tell you you're going to die.
Yeah.
So you better realize this and stop. And then there's the other guy, somebody else that I'm not going to say Mufti Menk is the complete opposite. He tries to maintain a good balance, but he's still trying to be the nice, inviting, warm, polite one.
Yeah.
Do you feel a mix of both of these is important in today's generation?
Yeah. Because sometimes you could see where you have to understand people's natures, right? Some people are very receptive to that kind of, coach-like approach.
Right. The coach-like approach.
Like just get up and do what you need to do. Stop sleeping and fix your life because one day you'll wake up and you'll be in the grave, right? So that sometimes that works. But there has to be kind of a universal approach where you'll see how did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveal the Quran? How did the Prophet ﷺ revolutionize a small group of Arabs, right? Who were completely, drowning in their jahili and ignorant ways. How did he completely revolutionize them to become one of the greatest empires in that area, actually, and in the world? So it did take time. Now, we are not responsible for our results. We're not responsible for what happens to people. We're only responsible in how we address them. So kind of taking the Quranic approach, which is in the beginning, in the Meccan period, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in majority verses that had to do with faith, verses that had to do with hope and fear and Jannah and Jahannam and reward and steadfastness and unity. And I believe this was a hadith also, that if the first commandment was to leave wine, then people would have said, we're never going to leave wine. But what you see is, for the first 13 years, the Muslims were being, trained spiritually. There were not many rulings being revealed. It was all, about their faith, about their hope. And then once the verse of prohibition of wine was revealed, they started pouring out their, wine containers, so much so that there was a river in the roads of Medina, of wine just flowing. Because
and
now
it happened right by the revelation of a verse.
Yeah, that's it. That's the nature of people. They need some time. So we have to give them that kind of feel good in the beginning. But you eventually have to come to that place where you say, this is halal, this is haram, and you have to abide by it. But you can't kind of just skip either one of them. Right?
You don't jump to.
Yeah, you don't jump to it. And also you don't just stay in the feel good until, they just stay there forever. Right.
Jazakallah khairan one more time. Inshallah, we'll do this again.
Inshallah.
I appreciate you coming here.
Really appreciate you inviting me to your home and this great setup. MashaAllah, Allah reward you for, your concern and your efforts. And, I would love to come again, inshallah.
Shukran. Thank you so much.